comedy is correct. There's no specific.
Hello, Brubs. We're back with the puzzle.
But Aristotle, writing in the 4th century, says
And a little.
that
He goes, why not?
derived from early phallic processions in honor of Dionysus. That is, processions through the street in which the people in the procession
Night owl.
images of
Elysian night owl beer.
in honor of Dionysus.
Pretty good.
Now, the actors of comedy, wore as part of their costume.
You can see we're probably 400 pieces into this puzzle.
And this offers some evidence for a connection with these phallic processions.
And I'd like to finish it tonight. That's all possible.
Whatever its origins or connections with Dionysus, competitions in comedy were added to the city Dionysia in 486. So throughout the 5th century, comic playwrights entered plays into competition at the city Dionysia alongside the tragedians. And competitions in comedy were added to another festival of Dionysus, the Lenaea, from about 440 onward. Before the Peloponnesian War, 5 comedies were performed per competition. During the war, the number may have increased to 3. We're not entirely sure about that. Now, our attempts to reconstruct the development of comedy are hampered by the fact that the earliest
Right, there's some legs.
play, Aristophanes and Carnians, dates to 425. So, well,
Right, that leg's already done, so
performed first in Athens. And
those legs.
even more importantly, Aristophanes is the only 5th century comedian, any of whose works have survived complete. So we've got 2 problems there. A gap of 60 years between comedy's inclusion in the city Dionysia and our first extant comedy. That makes it difficult to know what early comedy was like, although there is as large a gap between the traditional date of the beginning of tragedy. If you remember, Thespis supposedly put on the first tragedy in 534. Our first extant play by Aeschylus, the Persians, dates to 472. So there's about a similar gap there. But more importantly, since we have so little with which to compare Aristophanes' work,
There we
it's
go.
very difficult to say with certainty.
There's a piece that's got to go to here.
Comedy as a genre.
All right, so that's done.
Elements of Aristophanes' own style.
Let's try to find the legs here.
We have the 3 great tragedians to
You got
compare
this lady
with one
talking
another,
about
which gives us more of a sense of the overall
Aristophanes.
genre and the individual author's own style. With comedy, we have Aristophanes for the 5th
Aristophanes.
and then we
Pardon.
have fragments of other comedians. So it's difficult to talk about the development of comedy before Aristophanes. Scholars generally divide Athenian comedy into 3 forms from Aristophanes on: Old, Middle, and New comedy. The only complete examples of both Old and Middle comedy are by Aristophanes. There are fragments from other authors for both genres, but Aristophanes is our only complete exemplar of either Old or Middle comedy. We'll discuss Menander and New comedy in Lecture 17. And for most of this lecture, I'm going to concentrate on Old comedy because that's the bulk of what Aristophanes has left us. Old comedy, in effect, in its most basic definition, means comedy produced in the 5th century.
Definitely
There are some
antlers.
characteristics of
See if we
its
can get this
form
antler
and
in there.
subject matter that distinguish it from later
Should go right there.
And both of these elements, form and
Get
subject
in there.
matter, are important for our understanding
All right,
of
we
the
got that.
genre
See if
of
we can
old
get
comedy.
something connected to
Like
that.
tragedy, comedy featured all male casts, and the chorus in old comedy was of primary importance. The chorus
Importance.
of 24
Don't like how she says importance.
15 of tragedy.
Don't like it.
And several old comedies, Aristophanes and others, were named for their choruses. In Aristophanes' work, think of Acharnians, that is meant for Acarnia, Babylonians, clouds, nights, all of those are named for the characters of their choruses. The chorus was frequently costumed as animals in old comedy. So, for instance, 3 of Aristophanes' plays,
Hell
birds,
yeah.
frogs, and wasps, feature choruses that are costumed as well.
I'm gonna say that's part of a body.
Most of Aristophanes' extant comedies need 4 actors to perform all the roles, compared to the 3 actors of tragedy. In comedy, as in tragedy, the actors were masked, so one actor could play more than one role without confusion.
What do we got here?
Old comedy included fixed elements of form, which appear
Who's-
in all
who's
Aristophanes'
talking?
genre. The 2 most important formal elements were the agone and the parabus. Agone, literally struggle or contest, is where we get
Got to open the chat, so I don't know who the hell was talking.
Is a dialogue, a dispute, an argument between two characters sometimes, or two groups of characters. The
Taking all these pieces out here. I'm done with this.
is a choral section near the midpoint of an old comedy,
Boxes out.
where the action
Lived its
story
value.
stops and the chorus speaks directly to the audience, often in the playwright's voice, sometimes using the first person singular. The parabasis is always in
Maria Gutierrez.
What's
up, bruv?
The dactyl of dactylic hexameter. A dactyl is long, short, short, and anarchist is short, short, long. That's the characteristic meter of the parabasis. Now, these fixed formal elements, there are several others in old comedy, do not imply that old comedy as a genre was rigid or limited in its approach. Within the fixed structure, there
Put a
was
finger up in the air if you see this.
and for flights of
There you go, buddy.
And old comedy subject matter took full advantage of this. The
What are you,
subject
14
matter of old comedy
14
tended toward the fantastic,
years old?
bizarre, the grotesque. For instance, in
Are you,
Frauds,
buddy?
the god Dionysus journeys through the underworld to bring
About
back
this
the dead
piece?
tragedian.
No.
In Clouds, Socrates
I am
spins
12.
a basket in midair to try to study the sun. Birds features a society of birds, usually
This
translated
pube.
as cloud cuckoo land, that is a kind of parallel to Athenian society. In the play Peace, the main character tries to ride an enormous dung beetle up to Mount Olympus. As you see, this is not realistic drama.
The hell is this?
Fantastic and
A
even
jewel?
grotesque, outlandish plots.
Hey, buddy, it's a jewel.
These
Rare jewel.
outlandish, ridiculous, wild
I
plots
don't know what it is.
were nevertheless a means of discussing important political and
Important.
civil realities. The scholar Jeffrey Henderson puts it this way: these comedies, quote, typically depict Athens in the grip of a terrible and intractable problem, e.g., the war, bad political leaders, an unjust jury system,
I don't like it.
dangerous artistic or intellectual trends.
Stick with the
Which
legs.
is solved in a fantastic but essentially plausible way, often by a comic hero.
Stick with legs.
So, like comedy in so many cultures
The hell was
and many
that?
times, Aristophanes' comedy and old comedy in general, while it was extremely funny, at times slapstick, ludicrous in its plot, nevertheless has the serious core of the discussion of important political and social and cultural issues of the day. The comedies include, as part of that, a great deal of pointed satire of well-known individuals and public figures, often in extremely bawdy and scatological terms. This is not a polite genre. Now, Aristophanes, as I've
Aristophanes?
said, is the only surviving writer of old comedy, or let me put that another way around, he's not surviving. He's the only writer of old comedy whose works have survived to some extent, but we don't know much about his life. He was probably born no earlier than 460 and no later
I'm out
than
there.
450, and he
Yes.
probably died in or around 386, but those dates are uncertain. 11 of his plays are extant. We know that he wrote at least 32 others. So that means we have a much larger percentage of his work than we do of the three great tragedians. 11 out of 43 is much, much better than 7 out of Sophocles' 120, for instance. Of the 11 extant plays, the 9 old comedies that have survived were all written during the Peloponnesian War. And if you think back to what I said about the Peloponnesian War's effect on Athens in the last lecture, you can see why these comedies would have very serious political and social commentary at the heart of them. This was not a good time in Athens. Aristophanes won at least 6 first prizes and at least 4 second prizes, so he was quite successful. Political commentary, particularly directly concerning the Peloponnesian War, permeates most of the surviving 9 old comedies of Aristophanes. One of the clearest
Why?
examples of this, which I don't
Don't
have
keep
time to
trying
talk
that
about,
piece.
unfortunately, I'll just mention, is Lysistrata, where the women of Athens and Sparta together agree upon a sex strike until their husbands will end the war. That's perhaps the most commonly performed of Aristophanes' plays today. It's always topical, I suppose. Excuse me, Aristophanes' parabases, that's the plural of parabasis, tend to single out individual politicians for ridicule. And remember, these politicians
Got a drink, bud.
right there in the audience.
Right there.
So he wouldn't just be talking theoretically, he'd point at someone and hold him up to ridicule. It's a very direct kind of political commentary.
What is this?
Aristophanes' plays also very frequently satirize other playwrights, comedians and tragedians both, and intellectuals
Whoa, 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 whoa. We got a tip of something there.
Several plays
What
make
is it?
fun of some of the conventions of
What's that
tragic
one I
stage
looked at
work,
before?
and Euripides in particular also comes in for mockery based on his tragic plots and the style of his writing. Now,
Right
what
there?
I want to do for
No.
the rest of this
There?
lecture is focus
No.
on just two of Aristophanes' plays, Clouds and Frogs.
I'm gonna go right here.
That order, Clouds
Hell yeah.
first, which is a satire on philosophical and educational trends of the time, and then Frogs, which makes fun in part of tragedy, but also has some very serious things to say about tragedy and tragedians. So starting with Clouds. Clouds placed last. It was not a success at the City Dionysia of 423. The text of the play we have is a later unperformed revision from 418. So whatever was wrong with it in 423, Aristophanes rewrote it, but apparently never produced the rewritten version. In Clouds,
Let's get these out of there.
pokes fun at a group of philosophers called sophists. Now, the sophists were a group of itinerant teachers in Athens who specialized in teaching rhetoric and especially in teaching forms of argumentation. They were both very popular and very worrisome in 5th century Athens. They espoused a
This looks like
naturalistic and
legs for
relativistic
sure.
view of morality and of religion, or at least they apparently did. None of their works survive in more than the smallest fragments. Most of our information about the sophists
Legs. Legs.
did not like them. So it's a little bit difficult to
Legs?
reconstruct
Yes.
what exactly their approach was. Their opponents,
Small creator like me, let me guess.
morals and weakening religious beliefs. And one charge against them was
Guest
that they
what?
taught
Guest
young
host?
men to make the worse or
What are you gonna do?
weaker
Comment
argument
while I
better
puzzle?
or stronger. You can translate the Greek either
What's
way.
wrong with you?
They taught young men to make the
What's
worse
wrong with you, bro?
better or to make the weaker argument appear stronger. Now, apparently, what they did that caused this charge was they taught young men to argue either side of an issue, standard debating technique. But it was
I'm gonna say that goes there.
to 5th century Athenians because it seemed to dismoor a man's rhetorical skill from what he thought was true. And if you have a speaker who can argue perfectly persuasively something that is false in the assembly when you're going to vote on important issues such as going to war or not, if you have speakers who can persuasively argue false statements, then how do you know whom to trust and whom not to trust? But at the same time, the sophists were extremely popular as teachers of rhetoric, especially among those who aspired to speak in the assembly. They were useful, but they were also considered dangerous. Clouds paints an extremely funny, though probably inaccurate portrait of the great philosopher Socrates. Now, Socrates was not a sophist, but Aristophanes lumps him in with them nevertheless. Socrates differed from the sophists in many ways. For one thing, he did not accept money for teaching. It was considered rather shocking that the sophists did accept money for teaching, nor did he ever found a school. In Plato's Apology, which we'll talk about briefly in the next lecture, Socrates mentions the play Clouds and repudiates the picture of him that was given there. But for Aristophanes' purposes, probably, Socrates was
Very
the best
squarish.
philosopher of the time and therefore an easy
Where is
target to
that?
satirize. If you've seen one pointy-headed intellectual, you've seen them all. The one who's best known is the one that you use as a main character in your play. Now, the plot of Clouds features a farmer, Strepsiades, who wants his extravagant son Phidippides to receive a sophistic education because Phidippides' spending habits are such that Strepsiades knows the young man is going to end up sued for unpaid debts over and over again. So Strepsiades' brilliant idea
I don't want
is
this.
get the boy educated as a sophist, and then he can talk him his way out of the lawsuits that he will inevitably encounter. At first, Phidippides refuses to cooperate. He doesn't want to go to school and become a sophist. And so Strepsiades decides to get an education himself. Strepsiades goes to a school called the Frontisterion, which is usually translated as the Thinkery, where he meets several students and finally Socrates himself. The students are engaged in all sorts of absurd pseudoscientific problems, including figuring out how many flea feet a flea can jump by making little wax booties to put on the flea's feet and then measuring the jump with the booties, and trying to figure out whether gnats' humming sound is made through their mouths or through their rumps. Socrates first appears in the play, suspended in a basket in midair. He's studying astronomical and meteorological phenomena, so he's got to be up in the air to look at the things in the air. Strepsiades enrolls tries to instruct him in the basics of the education given there. The result is a ludicrous caricature of current philosophical, scientific, and linguistic theories. Strepsiades simply cannot understand anything that Socrates tells him. He gets it all absurdly wrong. And Socrates displays his religious unorthodoxy by praying clouds as goddesses. The chorus enters in costume as clouds, which gives the play its name. After the clouds parabasis, in which they claim, rather indignantly, that this is Aristophanes' best play, and the fact that it came in last was a mistake, Socrates tries to find out what
resort to shape sizing.
But he's absolutely hopeless at it. Socrates eventually
Look for this piece, since it's got rounded corners.
And recommends that he go back to his original plan and enroll his son Phidippides instead. Now, when Strepsiades brings his son Phidippides to the thinker,
These have some blue in it, looks like.
Better and worse arguments.
How about this?
And engage in an agon in which they each make the case for their own style of education.
Yes, no, no.
Aristophanes identifies the better argument with old-style education, traditional education, the worse argument with modern, sophistic education.
Yes.
And this agon between the two
There's the
forms of
nose.
learning encapsulates the very serious issues that lie behind the comedy.
Eyes have to be there.
What form of education, traditional or sophistic, will produce the best citizens? What form of education will best help Athens produce good citizens who might be able to find their way out of this terrible war we're in? Even more broadly than that, what is the appropriate reaction to the kind of intellectual challenge presented by the sophists and by others like them? To quote Jeffrey Henderson again, in Clouds, Aristophanes created a true comedy of ideas that captured the perhaps ineluctable essence
Don't you
of a
fucking
cultural
fall.
dilemma that worried thinking Athenians and even resolved. This dilemma can be stated rapidly. When a society suddenly generates serious intellectual challenges to the norms and beliefs that over long periods of time cohesion and stability, how should people react?
I don't like the glare.
Sophists are there. They are challenging a great many cultural norms and realities. How should a society react to that? Throw them out? Execute them? Ignore them? Decide that they're right and our own traditional culture has been wrong all along? It's not an easy question. And as Henderson says, it's a dilemma that has yet to be resolved even in our own day. Now, since Clouds is a comedy, the result of Phidippides' sophistic education is wildly absurd. He becomes so good a sophist that he makes a coherent argument for the right of sons to beat their fathers, and puts this into action by giving his father Strepsiades a good thrashing. Strepsiades is, understandably, aghast at the result of his son's education, and he reproaches the Clouds for misleading him. They had recommended a thinkery to him.
See ya, buddy.
If you misled me, look what the result is. The Clouds, in a rather serious speech, respond that Strepsiades himself chose to do wrong when he wanted an education for his son so that his son could cheat his creditors. So the Clouds say, you went into this with an incorrect desire to be able to cheat your creditors.
There we go.
You have no one to blame but
There's a
yourself
piece.
for whatever the result may be. And infuriated, Strepsiades sets out to burn down the thinkery. Socrates and the other pupils run out of the burning building and the play ends. This, by the way, is another very, very puzzling element of stagecraft that theater historians try to figure out, just like Ajax's suicide in Sophocles' Ajax or the earthquake in Euripides' Bacchae. What exactly happened when Strepsiades tried to burn down the thinkery at the end of Clouds? There was a wooden building, a wooden sea building at the back of the acting area in the Greek theater, but surely Aristophanes was not allowed to set it on fire. So how this was staged, we simply don't know. It's another one of those problems that we would like to know, but we don't. Now, Aristophanes' play Frogs, which is my personal favorite among his plays, was performed in 405 BC, so just the year before the end
These
of the
are legs,
Peloponnesian War,
too.
the year after the death of Sophocles and Euripides. It also addresses social and political problems of the day. It makes fun not of philosophers, but of tragedians. frogs is extremely funny. It holds up well in performance, even in our very different culture today. But like clowns, it also has some extremely serious issues at its core. The setup of the is that the
Legs
god
are very
Dionysus
difficult.
descends to Hades to bring back Euripides, who has just died. There are two extant plays, in which Dionysus actually appears as a character. Bacchae is one of them, frogs is
How about we
another.
find this piece
Dionysus
and that
wants to
dilemma?
save Athens, he says. That's a very serious desire on his part. He wants to save Athens, and to do this, he needs a tragedian. But all the great tragedians are dead. Sophocles and Euripides have just died.
Not even close.
Before, all the great tragedians are dead, so Dionysus is going to take a journey down to the underworld and bring back Euripides, he says, as the play begins. But the play quickly turns into a contest between Euripides and Aeschylus over which one of them should be resurrected. Sophocles is not a contestant. There are a couple of issues to think about there. Apparently, Aristophanes had pretty well finished the play before Sophocles died. Then Sophocles died, and Aristophanes had to write in just a line or two about how Sophocles has just arrived down here in the underworld. When Dionysus asks someone in the underworld if Sophocles doesn't want to take the chair of tragedy that Aeschylus has had since 456, Euripides has come in and said, "Give me the chair." Dionysus asks, "Doesn't Sophocles want the chair as well?" And he's told, "Oh no, Sophocles is extremely reverent towards Aeschylus. He's extremely unassuming. When he came down here, he greeted Aeschylus like a long-lost brother and said, 'Keep the chair yourself.'" So that is an interesting little nugget, again, about how Sophocles' character was perceived in 5th century Athens. As I mentioned in the lecture on Sophocles, he apparently was an extremely pleasant man. Well, the contest between Aeschylus and Euripides over which one is the better tragedian is also a contest over which one did more for Athens. And it becomes,
Right there.
in effect, a contest between
So that's done. How about this right here?
Aeschylus
No.
is an old-fashioned tragedian.
About
His
this right here.
language, his
Hell
memes,
yeah.
his poetry, his presentation are all very old-fashioned. But Aeschylus
That's
is
a very
also
distinct piece.
someone who fought at the Battle of Marathon. And the men who fought at Marathon
Very distinct.
were considered, I suppose, the closest parallel in our culture would be to say they were considered the greatest generation. They were looked back to with the same kind of admiration, the same kind of almost awe at their abilities, their patriotism,
There's
their
that piece
courage,
right
their
there. That little blade
that
piece.
we now tend to look back on the veterans of World War II with. And so Aeschylus is the spokesman for an old-fashioned style of tragedy, but he also represents the old-fashioned virtues of the generation that won the Battle of Marathon. Euripides represents the war-weary Athenians of the present generation. Remember, this is 405, just 1 year before Athens' final defeat. As well as representing a newer, more innovative style of playwriting, Euripides represents the whole new generation of Athenians who are tied up in this terrible
I feel
war
like that's a
and
bad
do
method.
not seem to have the virtues that their grandfathers had at Marathon. The contest between the two tragedians builds to an extremely funny actual weighing of lines. They each put lines in either pan of a scale to see which one is the weightier author.
Is that it?
And of course,
Sure is.
Aeschylus's lines consistently come down as weightier than Euripides' lines. The result is that Dionysus chooses to resurrect Aeschylus rather than Euripides. Euripides objects. Dionysus had come down to Hades promising to take Euripides.
Okay, what's that? It's got a little wing on it.
Says, "How dare you? You came down to get me, and now you're taking this old geezer back instead. What's with that?" And Dionysus answers Euripides by quoting an infamous line from Hippolytus at him. In the play Hippolytus, in Euripides' Hippolytus, that we looked at in the lecture on Euripides, when the nurse has first told Hippolytus about Phaedra's passion for him, she reminds Hippolytus, "Before I told you, you promised me that you would not pass on what I was about to say to you to anyone else." And Hippolytus says, "My tongue swore, but my heart or my mind remained unpledged." Now, in the play Hippolytus actually does keep his word to the nurse. He doesn't tell anyone else, even at the cost of his own life, Phaedra's secret. But that line
that.
My tongue swore, but my mind
No.
remained unpledged. Became infamous because it seems to sum up those same anxieties that Athenians had about the sophists. What you do with someone who says one thing but
Take off
thinks
this
or
coat.
means another. And so this line of Euripides, despite the fact that the character in the play Hippolytus did not actually act on that line apparently haunted Euripides for the rest of his life. And here in front, Dionysus responds to Euripides saying, "But you promised you'd take me." Dionysus responds with one of Euripides' own most famous or infamous lines, "My tongue swore, but my mind remained unpledged." Now, under its very, very funny storyline, Frogs is strong evidence that tragedy played a very serious social role in Athens, and that the mood of the city in 405 was anything but optimistic and right, as we know from subsequent events. A desire to recapture the ethos of the men who won the Persian War, to turn the clock back 50 years or more, is very, very understandable. Actually, to turn the clock back more like 80 years, as the Peloponnesian War moves towards its end. The play captured the mood of the day so well that the audience voted Aristophanes a crown of sacred olive and ordered that the play be given a second performance, which was truly extraordinary. As you'll remember from the first lecture on tragedy and on Aeschylus, plays generally were performed only once. Some of Aeschylus's plays were re-performed after his death.
How the hell could they get so famous then?
Right then,
How about that? No, that's not close, dude.
Extraordinary. As our last representative of old comedy, Frogs is a fitting valediction to the 5th century, to Athenian culture in the 5th century, and to the high point of Athenian literature. Now, Aristophanes wrote 2 more plays that have survived.
How about this piece? Find this sumbitch immediately.
Wealth. These are our only extant examples of middle comedy. The term middle comedy was invented by Alexandrian scholars to explain the undeniable changes that we observe between Aristophanes' works and the works of Menander some 60 years later. Since so very little of this genre has survived, it's difficult to say much at all about it, but we can notice a few structural differences between Aristophanes' last 2 plays, his 2 middle comedies, and his earlier ones. Most noticeably, the role of the chorus is very greatly reduced, and the parabasis disappears. So the formal elements of old comedy are on the way out. How much the works of other comic authors in the 4th century resembled Aristophanes' last 2 plays will remain a matter of conjecture unless and until we find a complete or mostly complete manuscript.
Something's going there, though.
Middle comedy. In general, it seems that middle comedy was less concerned with political and personal satire than old comedy had been. Though these elements are by no means absent, they're much less foregrounded. The fragments of other middle comedies, that is, other comedies aside from the 2 by Aristophanes, tend to indicate an interest in domestic life and especially in dining and
Say no, you dumbass.
This may be a matter of selection.
Right, so we need a bulbous piece to go right in there.
Most of
bulbous tip.
Of middle comedy occur in a work called
Find a bulbous tip.
Which basically means intellectuals at dinner, by a writer
Just
Athenaeus,
barely a piece.
Now,
barely.
Literary account of a dinner party. So what are the people in this literary account of a dinner
too
party
much.
likely to
Too much.
Quotations about
It's got to be just
and so whether that is as
tippy.
Foregrounded in middle comedy as these quotations make it seem, or whether this is just a matter of selection of those quotations.
Just a little nib.
Well, in this lecture we have looked at comedy, old and middle,
Unless this is it.
particularly at Aristophanes.
It's too much
In our
nib.
next lecture, we'll turn to a genre that shares elements from both history and drama. Plato's dialogues are written in prose like history, but they present themselves as interplays between characters like drama. And so it's to Plato that we'll turn in our next lecture.
All right, cool. No.
Welcome back to Lecture 16, in which we turn to looking at the works of one of the greatest thinkers and writers of all time, Plato. Plato was born in Athens around 429 or 427 BC, Both his parents were members of wealthy families, but unlike most wealthy and well-born young men of his time, Plato chose to devote his time to philosophy and to writing rather than to a public career. Now, clearly, Socrates was the primary influence on the development of Plato's philosophical thought. Unfortunately, we don't know when the two first met. But since Plato had two elder brothers, he could have met Socrates through them when he himself was still quite young. We know that he was no older than 30 at the time of Socrates' execution, and Plato's apparent desire to rehabilitate his teacher's and mentor's reputation may have been the impetus for him to begin writing. During his lifetime, Plato wrote 28 philosophical works. Unfortunately, the exact chronology of these is still debated, which one is earliest, which one is latest, and how the ones in between fit in. He also wrote 13 letters, or at least there are 13 letters attributed to Plato still existent, but their genuineness is a matter of dispute. Some scholars accept them, some don't. Plato finally founded the Academy, a school for students of philosophy. Now, the question of the relationship between Socratic philosophy and Plato's own philosophy is famously and formidably difficult. Plato's writings,
this is garbage method, but
it's not his letters, are cast in dialogue form, and in these dialogues, Socrates appears as a character. But the relationship between the words and ideas of the Socrates, put that in quotation marks, in the dialogues, and the actual Socrates who taught Plato and who was executed in 399 BC, that relationship, what in the dialogues is actually Socratic and what is Platonic, is often referred to as the Socratic question. Scholars have differed, and it probably doesn't surprise you that they have, and will continue to differ greatly over how to answer this question of how much of what the character Socrates says in Plato's dialogues is genuinely Socrates and how much is just Plato. And the situation is further complicated by the fact that we don't have a secure chronology for Plato's philosophical writings. If we did, and we knew the order they were written in, we could compare what Socrates says in the early ones to what Socrates says in the late ones and see if there are any patterns, any differences, any developing ideas that only show up in the later ones. But since we don't have a secure chronology, we can't even do that. Now, most scholars probably accept that the Apology, Plato's account of Socrates' speech in his own defense at his trial, preserves something close to Socrates' own words. When Plato is writing down what Socrates said in his defense when he was on trial for his life for corrupting the youth of Athens, Plato probably writes something pretty close to what Socrates actually said. Beyond that, it's difficult to say much with any certainty that everybody would agree on about the Socratic question. The Socratic question exists largely because Socrates wrote nothing himself, and that means our knowledge of him, of his ideas, of his philosophical viewpoint, rests entirely on the writings of those.
Gotta be it right there.
Plato, Xenophon, and even
not even close.
Several of Socrates' other pupils, apart from
Well, I
Plato,
guess we'll just keep going.
also wrote Socratic dialogues
Garbage method. It's not going in there.
Classified such Socratic
Not going in there.
dialogues as a self-contained genre of fiction, which would seem to indicate that Aristotle did not think they had that much direct relationship to what the actual Socrates himself said. But of these dialogues, only Plato's have survived, so we don't have the others for comparative purposes. Now, as we saw in the last lecture, Aristophanes paints a comic portrait of Socrates in clouds and portrays Socrates as a sophist. Most scholars
That's going to go there, ain't it?
Socrates is a caricature, and an inaccurate one at that.
Yes.
This caricature may have been very, very funny in 423 when clouds was
About right there.
but
No.
it bore very grim fruit in 399 when Socrates was put on trial for his life and was executed. The charges on which Socrates was executed included the accusation that he taught young men to make the worse argument appear better. Exactly what was said about the sophists, and exactly, if you remember, the focal point of clouds, where the worse argument and the better argument come on and have an agon, and then Phidippides learns to make the worse argument appear better to the extent of justifying beating his father. So Socrates was charged in all seriousness and put to death on a charge that was leveled at sophists and that may have had a great deal to do with his portrayal in Clouds. He was also charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and with failing to respect or to honor, the Greek verb can mean either one, the gods of Athens. Now, there are many reasons why the Athenians turned on Socrates, but one that cannot be discounted is that one of his young associates, a man named Alcibiades, had proven himself during the Peloponnesian War to be both deeply persuasive and deeply treacherous. Alcibiades went over to Sparta. He went and helped the Spartans. Then he abandoned the Spartans and went and spent some time in Persia. Then he somehow talked the Athenians into taking him back in. So he was a traitor, but he was also an extremely persuasive speaker. It's not, I think, in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, entirely incomprehensible that some Athenians would have suspected that Socrates, like the sophists, was teaching young men to argue positions fluently without any moral grounding whatsoever. Alcibiades certainly seems to be a test case for that. Xenophon, our third source of information on Socrates, is best known in modern times as an historian, but he also wrote reminiscences of Socrates, who he had known personally. Apparently, Plato and Xenophon both wrote, at least in part, to try to rehabilitate Socrates' reputation, both from his trial and execution and from the portrait in Clouds. But Xenophon's Socrates is very, very different from the one Plato shows us. The Socrates Xenophon portrays is much more straightforward than Plato's character, and in addition, he is a spokesman for the traditional ideas about virtue, while Plato's Socrates operates not by offering his own opinions or articulating his own ideas, but by eliciting ideas from others through questioning, the famous Socratic questioning. Now, Plato's dialogues range over a very great number of topics, including ethics, politics, the nature of the soul, the construction of the cosmos, various other things. Plato's own opinions are notoriously hard to deduce from his writings. It's not only hard to deduce what's truly Socratic, it's also hard to deduce Plato's own opinions about these matters that he discusses in his dialogues, because Plato never speaks in a narrator's voice.
No, that helps, I think.
Try to deduce the point, his opinion, from his character statements. And just as it is never safe in drama to assume that a character speaks for an author, we shouldn't say, as Shakespeare says, who steals my purse steals trash. We should say, as Iago says. And that's a very different thing. So we can never be certain that Plato's characters, even Socrates, speak for Plato. Indeed, the reader almost becomes an interlocutor in the dialogue, which is left open-ended and unresolved. This is especially true in the so-called aporetic dialogues. That's a word that comes from the Greek word aporia, which refers first and foremost to tracklessness or pathlessness, a place that you can't find a way through. Means metaphorically a puzzle, something that can't be figured out.
A puzzle.
And there are several dialogues which are called the aporetic dialogues, usually assumed to be early, but we don't know that, in which Socrates questions interlocutors who think that they know what a particular concept, for instance, piety, means. And as the question
Go
goes
in
on,
there, peace, one of you.
that the only definition that can be reached is what a particular concept is not, rather than what it is. And thus the reader is left, like Socrates' fellow characters, in a state of aporia with no definite answers, with no definite definition of something that they think they know about before they start thinking more clearly about it. Now, like Plato's other works, The Republic, on which I want to concentrate for the rest of this lecture, is a dialogue in which Socrates and various interlocutors discuss and debate topics of interest. The primary topics of discussion in The Republic are justice, both for individuals and for the state, and what the ideal state would be. Of course, we don't know exactly when Plato wrote The Republic, but it is generally assumed to be a work of his maturity. The translator Desmond Lee says cautiously, quote, "If we think of it as having been written round about 375 BC, we shall not be far wrong," close quote. So around 375 will do. The dramatic date of the dialogue, however, is around 450 BC. So Plato is probably writing in 375, but he sets the dialogue, the characters and the setting are in 420. That means Socrates in the dramatic daily dialogue. Socrates is around 50 years old and some 20 years away from his execution. The setting of the Republic is the house of a man named Cephalus, a native of Syracuse who's a resident alien in Athens. His sons Polemarchus, Lysias, and Euthydemus are all present, as are Plato's two older brothers Glaucon and Adeimantus. And another character in the dialogue of the Republic is Thrasymachus, a sophist, who responds to
About
Socrates'
this
questions about
motherfucker.
justice in Book 1.
No, it's
Now,
not even
these
close.
characters were all real people, and it's worth pausing for a moment to consider at the outset of our discussion of Republic what effect Plato's audience's knowledge of these people's later fates would have had on their reading of the Republic. Remember, these people are all alive in 420. Plato writes in around 375. People reading the Republic then know what happened to all of these characters, and it's pretty grim. Cephalus was already an old man in 420. He probably died before the end of the Peloponnesian War. However, his sons Polemarchus and Lysias were both arrested by the 30 tyrants during their reign of terror that I mentioned in the
30 dirty tyrants.
Polemarchus was executed. Lysias managed to escape but had to flee Athens. Now, Lysias was later an orator, and we know the details of this family's fate from his orations. That's pure luck for us. We have Lysias' speeches that let us know what happened to these characters in Plato's dialogue. Think about what this means. This great discussion of justice and the ideal state takes place.
Looking for pieces is a dead end, I think.
By the 30 tyrants, an embodiment of injustice, and a household of people who are not
Get you in bad habits.
Citizens of the society in which they're living. They're resident
As I
aliens.
continue to do it,
There's no method for them to get Athenian citizenship.
I'll try every
This is just
frickin'
one example
piece.
of the kind of ironies that run through the Republic, and of course, throughout it all, there's also our knowledge
There you
that
go.
Socrates, who is discussing justice and the ideal state, will be killed by Athenian society in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. Well, the Republic begins as a debate of the question, what is justice? And at first, the discussion focuses on justice between individuals. Later in Book 2, Socrates extends the terms to the nature of justice in the state as an entity. Book 1 resembles an aporetic dialogue so closely that some scholars
There's that piece right there.
first as a freestanding work.
Now we got a very sharp piece.
Republic on afterwards to develop it into the 10-book version we know. In the opening book, Socrates questions Thrasymachus about the nature of justice, but Thrasymachus is unable to give any adequate account of what justice is. However, unlike the aporetic dialogues in which that would be where the topic is left, that we can define what justice is not, but we can't say what it is, in the Republic, Socrates and his other interlocutors are not content to let the matter rest, and they continue on for 9 more books. Thrasymachus retires into the background after Book 1, and Book 2 opens with Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, pushing the question further. Now, Adeimantus' challenge to Socrates in Book 2 is a pivotal moment. Adeimantus lays out the traditional Homeric system of valuation of justice. Think back to the lecture on the Iliad, Timae, and so forth. And he declares that it is not sufficient. Adeimantus says, and I'm quoting from Desmond Lee's translation, all you professed partisans of justice have never blamed injustice or praised justice except for the reputation and honors and rewards they bring. No one, poet or layman, has ever sufficiently inquired what the effect of each is, each meaning justice or injustice, on the mind of the individual, an effect that may be unobserved by either gods or men, or explained how it is that injustice has the worst possible effect on the mind and justice the reverse. Had you adopted that method from the beginning and set about convincing us when we were young, there would be no need to protect ourselves against our neighbors wronging us. Each man would be his own best protector because he would be afraid that by doing wrong, he was doing himself a grave and lasting injury.
What do you think? Personal.
Adeimantus here puts this challenge to the traditional view of justice in terms of what the young should be taught. If you taught us this when we were young, he says, we would all be better off. And this sets up one major thread of the rest of the Republic, the education of the young. The dialogue then focuses on the nature of the ideal state, the state that would treat its citizens most justly, and what form of education system would be necessary to bring about an ideal state that would treat its citizens justly. In books 2 and 3, Socrates and his interlocutors discuss the role of literature and poetry in the ideal state, especially for the class of citizens whom Socrates calls the guardians, from whom the rulers of the state will be chosen. Book 4 examines what justice would consist of in a state ruled by specially trained guardians. In Book 5, Socrates outlines the roles of women and children in the ideal state. Women will be educated just as men are. Children will be raised communally by the state and not by their parents. At this point, Adeimantus requests proof from Socrates that it would be possible to organize a state along the lines Socrates has indicated. And very interestingly, Socrates responds that he has been describing an ideal state, not necessarily a possible one. The Republic thus begins the tradition in Western literature of utopian narratives. Bear that in mind later on in the course when, for instance, with Professor Hertzman, you study Thomas More's Utopia, this discussion of an ideal state that perhaps the author realizes cannot ever be brought into existence. But Socrates says that for imperfect states such as currently exist to approach his ideal state, the most important point is that the ruling class, the guardians, must be trained as philosophers, a word which in Greek, of course, just means lover of wisdom. And this leads to a discussion of the nature of the philosopher. If we need to train our guardians as philosophers, what is a philosopher? You see how one question leads to another. As the dialogue moves into Book 6, Socrates returns to the question of the education of the philosopher rulers. He says that they must study the good, with a capital G. And then, of course, he's asked reasonably enough to provide a definition of the good. He cannot answer directly, but articulates the theory of ideas or forms, which are the only reality. The theory that what we see as reality is a reflection of transcendent abstract realities such as the good, the beautiful, and so on. Now, in Book 7, Socrates illustrates his view of education with the well-known allegory of the cave. He imagines people chained in a cave with their backs to the entrance, watching shadows projected on a wall in front of them by the light of a fire behind them. These prisoners think that the shadows are reality. And Socrates says if one of them were freed and taken outside, he would at first be pained and confused and upset. If, after he had learned to see the real world, he went back into the cave and told his fellow prisoners what he had seen, Socrates says he would be mocked and even killed by those fellow prisoners, which may well be a foreshadowing of what we know happened to Socrates, because Socrates says that the philosopher who has grasped something of the nature of reality itself is in the position of the freed prisoner. He voluntarily goes back into the cave and tries to tell the rest of us what it was that he has seen, what it was that he's apprehended, and we react by mocking him and killing him. The conversation then returns in books 8 and 9 to a discussion of the different types of human beings and of governments, and in Book 10 it returns to the role of poetry. The Republic ends with a discussion of the immortality of the soul. Now, I feel almost like a criminal myself for running through the Republic that quickly, and by leaving out as much as I've had and going as quickly as I have done, I have undoubtedly distorted a great deal. But in the time that's left to me, I want to concentrate on one aspect of the Republic, the distrust of poetry and the exclusion of poetry from the ideal state. Because this is, of course, on literature after all, and in the Republic, Socrates, in quotations, the character Socrates, talks about literature, the role of literature, and in fact, he gives it only a very limited role in his ideal state. Socrates
I agree with him.
Poetry in books 2 and 3, where he objects to its use in Athens on the grounds both of its content and its form. And in Book 10, he gives a further discussion of why poetry would be problematic in his ideal state. And by poetry, he means pretty much what we would classify as literature in general. First, in books 2 and 3, Socrates objects to the content of traditional poetry in several ways. He says, to begin with, there's the problem that many of the traditional stories are simply false, and that they misrepresent the nature both of gods and of ancient heroes. As examples of incorrect treatment of the gods, he cites Homer's gods in general as quarrelsome and violent towards one another. Remember what I said in the lecture on Euripides about the problems brought through anthropomorphism. If that's how we conceptualize our gods, we give them all the characteristics of human beings, this leads to some problems in our understanding of and treatment of the gods. And Socrates in the Republic says that just can't be right. Zeus can't be an adulterer. The gods can't get into fistfights on Mount Olympus, as Homer shows them doing in the Iliad. That just cannot be accurate. Similarly, he objects to the depiction of heroes, for instance, to the depiction of Achilles as greedy and vengeful. He says, we cannot have our citizens believe that Achilles, whose mother was a goddess and whose father was a man of the utmost self-control and a grandson of Zeus, was in such a state of inner confusion that he combined in himself the two contrary maladies of ungenerous meanness about money and excessive arrogance to gods and men. So Socrates in the Republic is not impressed with the character of Achilles in the Iliad. Notice he doesn't deny that Achilles really existed. He says there was a real Achilles, but Homer has misrepresented his character.
That sounds insane.
Socrates objects to stories that instill fear and timidity in their hearers, rather than encouraging the characteristics of courage and self-control. Remember, he's talking about the education of the guardians, in particular, the rulers of the ideal state. So, for instance, he says passages in Homer that conduce to fear of the afterlife must be extirpated. If we don't throw Homer out entirely, we've got to vulgarize him. We've got to edit him. And we need to get rid of passages that make people afraid of death. Speaking of the training of the guardians, he says, what if they are to be brave? Must we not extend our range to include something that will give them the least possible fear of death? Will anyone who in his heart fears death ever be brave? And will anyone who believes in terrors in the afterlife be without fear of death and prefer death in battle to defeat in slavery? And the answers to those that his interlocutor gives him are, of course, no. And so Socrates continues, it looks then as if we shall have to control storytellers on this topic too. We must ask the poets to stop giving their present gloomy account of the afterlife, which is both untrue and unsuitable to produce a fighting spirit, and make them speak more favorably of it, of the afterlife. The first example he cites of such passages is a comment made in Book 11 of the Odyssey when Achilles' ghost speaks to Odysseus. Odysseus tries to comfort Achilles for being dead by recounting the great funeral the Greeks had given him. And Achilles says to Odysseus, I would rather be a serf in the house of some landless man with little enough for himself to live on than be king of all the dead men that have done with life. Remember Achilles' choice between two fates in the Iliad, to live a short and glorious life or a long and uneventful one. In the Odyssey, the soul of Achilles seems to say, I got it wrong. That's a very interesting topic in Homeric studies that unfortunately we can't go into here. But Socrates quotes the line
Can't do it.
To say that such a sentiment must be kept from the ears of the guardians in training, lest it undermine their courage. Now, Socrates' objection to poetry in this section of the Republic is not based solely on the content of traditional poetry. He also objects to its form. Socrates says that all literature consists either of narration, that would be historical narratives like Herodotus, or representation, or a combination of the two. By representation,
all right, we need a sharp corner.
Of a character other than his own. In its milder form, representation consists of direct quotation, as in Homer, where Homer quotes speeches of his characters. In its stronger form, it turns into acting, where the speaker presents himself in character as someone else. Now, traditional Greek education involved reciting aloud. That was the way learning was done. The boys in school recited aloud the passages they've been reading. Thus, Socrates wants to exclude representation from the poetry that the guardians will study, so that they will not be trained in the expression of inferior characters' viewpoints. He thinks by reciting the lines of inferior characters, they'll be trained to some extent to adapt those characters themselves. While he can admire great poets and great performers, Socrates says that they have no place in his ideal state. He'll throw them out entirely. He comments, if we are visited in our state by someone who has the skill to transform himself into all sorts of characters and represent all sorts of things, and he wants to show off himself himself and his poems to us. We shall treat him with all the reverence due to a priest and giver of rare pleasure, but shall tell him that he and his kind have no place in our city, and we shall send him elsewhere after anointing him with myrrh and crowning him with fillets of wool. So he's treated with respect. For ourselves, Socrates continues, we shall for our own good employ storytellers and poets who are severe rather than amusing, who portray the style of the good man, and in their works abide by the principles we laid down for them when we started out on this attempt. Doesn't sound like much fun, but that's what he says. Poets who are severe rather than amusing. Now, Socrates' analysis of the problems inherent in poetry's form are developed further in Book 10, art, including poetry as a copy of a copy. Remember, what we see as reality is merely a reflection of the ideas, or the forms. And so, poetry or art of any kind is a copy of what we think is reality, which is itself only a copy of the true reality. So art is two removes from reality. And Socrates says that the rational part of the human soul does not respond to imitation, and thus art and poetry appeal to a lower part of the soul than the rational. That's a problem in itself. Furthermore, because of their appeal to the part of the soul that enjoys emotions such as pity and grief, poetry can influence people away from virtue. Socrates elaborates on this point. He says, the poet gratifies and indulges the instinctive desires of a part of us which we forcibly restrain in our private misfortunes with its hunger for tears and for an uninhibited indulgence in grief. In other words, when something terrible actually happens to one of us, Socrates says, we think that the appropriate response is to exhibit self-control, to keep our emotions inside, not to weep and wail and cry and carry on. But he says that when we watch someone else enacting these emotions, we think there's nothing wrong with being moved. We can sit and
This
cry
puzzle
and
is
see
kicking my
the
ass.
misfortunes of Oedipus and not think that we are in any way training our soul in bad habits. But he concludes,
You would think finding these pieces would be really easy, but for whatever reason, can't do it. I can't do it.
And that if we let our pity for the misfortunes of others grow too strong, it will be difficult to restrain our feelings in our own misfortune. Now, by the way, I don't have a lecture on Aristotle in this course, unfortunately, but those of you who know that Aristotle said the purpose of tragedy was to provide a catharsis of pity and fear, a cleansing of pity and fear. Aristotle was almost definitely writing a direct response to this passage in Republic, to say, no, arousing pity and fear is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It lets us have a catharsis of those emotions. It doesn't train us to wallow in them in our own cases. So, in the ideal state, poetry must be carefully controlled. Only hymns praising the gods and poems praising virtuous men will be allowed, Socrates concludes. Now, what are we to make of this critique of poetry and Socrates' exclusion of most traditional forms of poetic expression from his ideal state? There is a really obvious irony here. Plato's Socrates says that literary productions, copies of copies, are inadmissible and potentially harmful, and he says so in a beautifully crafted literary production. Furthermore, Plato singles out Homer for exclusion, but he himself quotes Homer and the same line, Achilles' line about preferring to be a serf rather than a king over the dead, in no less important a context than the allegory of the cave. Plato quotes that line approvingly. Even more, Socrates identifies dialogue without intervening narration as the most dangerous and pernicious form of poetic imitation, but this is precisely the form of the Republic itself. The entire Republic consists of in-character speeches. The narrator speaks in the first-person singular as Socrates. So we have to take the word of Socrates, the character, for it, that speaking in character is a pernicious thing. This is, to put it mildly, ironic. As with every statement in a Platonic dialogue, we have to be careful not to assume a simple correspondence between the words of the character Socrates in the Republic and Plato's own beliefs. And this is particularly true, I think, in the Republic, where we have to bear in mind the distance between the ideal state as imagined and the possibilities for enactment, because Socrates himself says this may not be possible to realize, this is an ideal. Would Plato himself even have wanted this ideal state to be brought into existence? Or are some of the precepts he lays out meant to challenge us rather than meant as recommendations? We leave these questions unanswered in our own version of Socratic aporia. And in the next lecture, we turn to a slightly easier genre to understand, new comedy and the work of Menander. Welcome back to Lecture 17. This lecture has two main objectives. First, to talk about new comedy and the work of playwright Menander, and second, to talk about the Hellenistic age of Greek culture and Hellenistic literature in general, and there we'll focus on the works of the poet Callimachus. So to start with Menander and new comedy is the last remaining form of Athenian drama that we have to discuss in this course. It flourished from the late 4th through the 3rd centuries BC, and we know the names of more than 80 writers of new comedy who were active in Athens between 325 and 200 BC. However, we have only one complete play of new comedy, the Dyskolos, or Grouch, or Grumpy Old Man, as it can be translated, of Menander. Menander was born probably around 344 and died around 292 BC. He wrote nearly 100 plays himself. He staged his first one in 321, but he won only 8 victories. So he was not extremely successful during his lifetime, but after his death, Menander's works became extremely popular. However, by the 8th century AD, all his plays were lost, and until the 20th century, our knowledge of Menander's plays, and thus really of new comedy itself, depended on only a very few fragments and also primarily on the adaptations of Menander's works and the works of other new comic poets by the Roman comedians Terence and Plautus. So the rediscovery of Menander, of some of Menander's actual works, is one of the great success stories of 20th century classical scholarship, both literary and archaeological. In 1907, significant segments of 3 of Menander's plays, The Arbitrance, The Girl Who Had Her Haircut, and The Samian Woman, were published from a manuscript found in Egypt. The total amount of text of these plays was about 1,600 lines. Now that may not sound like a whole lot for 3 plays, but before this, these 3 plays had been known from only a very few scanty quotations amounting to about 20 lines of text total for all 3 of them combined. So to go from 20 lines to 1,600 lines was a very significant jump in our understanding of these plays. The all but complete text of Dyskolos, the Grouch, was discovered in Egypt in 1957 and published in 1959. And the manuscript that contained Dyskolos also contained large sections of 2 other plays. Since then, substantial fragments of several other of Menander's works have come to light, and the result is that we now have one almost complete play of Menander's. Dyskolos is slightly damaged, but it's pretty much all there, and enough of several others to have a fairly good understanding of their plots and their style. These discoveries have tended to confirm what scholars already thought they knew about the nature of new comedy. It's always nice when our theories turn out to be right. Scholars had thought from the fragments that we have and from Plautus and Terence that we knew pretty well how new comedy worked. And these discoveries of Menander's works have tended to confirm those earlier theories, both about new comedy and about its differences from old and middle comedy. And there's good reason to hope for more to come. Menander was clearly very popular in Egypt, and Egypt, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, is a very rich source for papyrus, both fragments and whole papyruses, because the climate is so conducive to preserving papyrus. So as archaeological excavations go on, we may discover more plays by Menander. Now, what these plays show us is that new comedy was substantially different from old comedy, particularly in its subject matter. The plots of new comedy tend to revolve around personal relationships, misunderstandings, problems between members of the family, and reconciliations effected largely through chance. and marry. So that's the kind of difficulty and resolution caused often by chance discovery of who this girl actually is. Now, a variation on this plot device that is repeated in Roman adaptations and that modern audiences find deeply disturbing is that a young man discovers that his newly married wife is the same woman he had previously raped. This is an area where the cultural difference between our society and the society that at least considers new comedy amusing, whether this reflects any societal realities or not, they at least found this an amusing plot. And here is where we can see the distance between our societal assumptions and theirs perhaps the most clearly. For one thing, the use of rape as a plot device with really no opprobrium against the rapist reflects, for one thing, an entirely male viewpoint of audience and playwright alike, I think. The girl's trauma is not considered at all. The rape is a plot device whereby the young man, usually at a religious festival at night, forces himself on a girl he doesn't know. A few months later, he gets married. He discovers his new wife is pregnant. She's too pregnant to have conceived after the marriage. He's about to repudiate her. And then, lo and behold, it turns out that she was the girl he raped at that festival.
What?
Happy ending, right? Now, as I say, this is very disturbing to us. But one of the cultural impetuses for this plot is that in the assumptions of ancient Greek society, a young girl could not allow herself to be seduced and remain admirable or remain a good character. So if you want to have the discovery that the wife the man thinks is adulterous is actually completely blameless, rape comes into the picture as a plot device in that regard. Another favorite topos in new comedy is that of the lost or misidentified child. Specifically, there are plots in which a girl who is kidnapped as a baby is restored to her rightful parents after spending her early years as a slave. And clearly, this could facilitate the star-crossed lovers type of plot. A young man falls in love with a slave girl. They can't marry. Then he discovers that she's actually the kidnapped daughter of a family of his same social status. They end up marrying. In general, Menander's plots are driven by tensions, difficulties, and misunderstandings between individuals, parent and child, husband and wife, master and slave, and their resolutions. And with this overview of the typical plots of new comedy, we can see some of its most important differences from old comedy. Unlike old comedy, new comedy was almost entirely apolitical. It was written for performance in Athens, and the plays are usually set in some area in or around or near Athens, but they're by no means, through their plots, tied to any particular time or any particular place. They could be anywhere. There are almost no overt political references in new comedy. So in that regard, it's very different indeed from old comedy. Mockery of named individuals is entirely absent. The characters instead are stock everyman type characters. They're entirely fictional. And they are often stock characters of the type the young lover, the grumpy old man, the ingenue, the clever slave, that kind of recognizable character, so you know almost where you are with the characters before you get into the individual plot. New comedy plots rely heavily on coincidence and chance to bring about their happy endings, but the fantastic element of old comedy is entirely lacking. While chance and luck certainly play important roles in new comedy, there aren't any talking animals or flying dung beetles or choruses of clouds, no visits to Cloud Cuckoo Land or the underworld, none of those things we saw in old comedy. Instead, the plots are firmly set within the everyday world. The events may be unusual. It's not a very common thing to discover that your long-lost kidnapped daughter has been brought up as a slave in the house next door, for instance. The events may be unusual, but their content is not. And in this regard, I think it would hardly be an exaggeration to say that new comedies are the ancestors of our modern situation comedies, since the plots are concerned with fairly average everyday characters and the situations in which they find themselves. One could also argue that Menander's works are the ultimate ancestors of realistic novels, put realistic in quotation marks there, but novels which stress personal relationships, and in particular novels which stress love and marriage, which go through a series of misunderstandings misunderstandings between the not yet betrothed couple, and the happy ending consists in their marriage. I'm thinking in particular of the works, for instance, of Jane Austen, which you'll study later on in the course with Professor Heffernan. They, in many ways, follow the same kind of pattern as Menander's comedies. New comedy also is very different from old comedy in its form and in its style. There's no fixed structure of agon and parabasis. We saw how that was already disappearing in middle comedy. The chorus is almost completely gone. In new comedy, the chorus's only role is to divide the acts, so to speak, by musical interludes. In fact, there are some manuscripts in which the word chorus is just written in with no words provided for it. It no longer matters what they sing. They're just a between-act musical entertainment. So that's a great difference from old comedy. While the plots of new comedy are humorous, they are funny, they don't feature the bawdy or raucous jokes of old comedy. And the language itself, interestingly, gives the impression of everyday colloquial speech. I say the impression because this is still poetry. These works are still written in meter, so they're not the way that people actually talk, but they give the impression the language is simple and straightforward sounding, despite the fact that it's metrical. Now, Discalus, the one complete play by Menander that has survived, or rather that has been resurrected in the 20th century, illustrates many of these elements of new comedy in its plot and in its structure. The basic plot of Discalus involves potentially thwarted young love. In this case, the young lovers are potentially thwarted because of the misanthropic nature of the girl's father, the grouch or grumpy old man of the play's title. The prologue of the play is spoken by the god Pan. He takes no direct part in the action after the prologue, but he speaks the prologue, gives us essential background information. Pan, of course, is that half-ghost, half-man god who is in effect the god of the countryside, of nature, of the natural world. And Pan tells us in the prologue to the play, that the plot will involve families living on two adjacent farms. So it's in the countryside near Athens, and it deals with two families on two adjacent farms. On the right, Pan says, is the farm of Cnemon, the grumpy old man, who lives alone with his daughter Myrine. After Myrine's birth, life with Cnemon had become utterly intolerable for his wife. He had married her when she was a widow with a son. After their daughter was born, Cnemon's wife left him, moved onto the farm next door, and that's where she now lives with her grown son, Gorgias. Now, Pan tells us that Myrine, who's old enough now to be of marriageable age, so say around 14, 15, something like that, is a very good girl who deserves a better life than she's likely to have with her horrible old father. And Pan has, therefore, caused a rich young man named Phistratus to fall in love with Myrine. So after setting up the situation for us, Pan exits, and Phistratus and his friend Kyrios enter, talking about Phistratus' troubles, about the fact that he's in love with Myrine, but can't marry her. In fact, he can't even talk to her. He's been thwarted in all his attempts to court her by Cnemon's threats of violence. The old grouch chases any and all callers away from his door. He doesn't care what they're there for. If you come to try to talk to him or his daughter, he chases you away and threatens you with violence. Now, Phistratus tells Gorgias, Myrine's stepbrother, or half-brother rather, that he wants to marry Myrine, and Gorgias agrees to help. After some intricate convolutions of the plot, I'm summarizing very briefly here, Cnemon falls into a well. That's where chance comes into it, because Gorgias and Phistratus rescue him from the well he's fallen into. And so, because of this chance occurrence, they have the opportunity to rescue Cnemon from the well. He is so grateful that he formally adopts Gorgias, his wife's son from a previous marriage. He formally adopts Gorgias as his son and gives Gorgias the privilege of picking a husband for Myrine. He says, now that you're my fully adopted son, you can decide whom your little sister gets to marry. And Gorgias, of course, picks Phistratus. So happy ending for that couple. Just to round things out, Phistratus persuades his own father to allow Phistratus' sister to marry Gorgias. So we have a double wedding, everybody's happy, everything ends well for all concerned. That is a typical new comedy type of plot. You can see the elements I was talking about there. These are average, everyday people. They're not flying up to Olympus on a dung beetle. They're not going down to the underworld. They're not talking to birds or frogs or wasps. They are average, everyday people. The comedy consists in their working through a convoluted situation of difficulties, misunderstandings, personality conflicts. And it's funny. It's very humorously done. It comes to a resolution in a happy ending, and a happy ending that in particular revolves around marriage, in this case, a double marriage. Now, at this point, I want to move to the second main focus of this lecture and talk a bit about the Hellenistic age of Greek literature. Menander's working life corresponds almost exactly with the beginning of what we call the Hellenistic age. The Hellenistic age is the term generally applied to the time period from the death of Alexander the Great, that is from 323 BC, to the Battle of Actium, which I'll explain in just a minute or two, in 31 BC. So the standard dates of the Hellenistic age are 323 through 31 BC. Hellenistic in this context means Greek influenced or Greek dominated. In the 5th century, you'll remember from the lectures on Herodotus and Thucydides, in the 5th century, the power struggles between Athens and Sparta focused on their hegemony over other, at least originally independent Greek city-states. So the power struggles of the 5th century were Greek city-states trying to dominate other Greek city-states. But in 338, that is late in the 4th century, Philip of Macedon, after prolonged campaigns, won the Battle of Chaeronea, which effectively ended the era of independent Greek city-states, and Philip gained dominance over all of Greece. His son, Alexander the Great, so-called, ruled from 336 to 323 BC, and Alexander expanded his empire from what his father Philip had left him to include a vast stretch of territory that stretched from Egypt in the south all the way to the borders of India in the east, an absolutely phenomenally large territory to be controlled by one king, one emperor in the ancient world. Now, Alexander died in 323 BC, and when he died, his empire divided into several kingdoms, which we call the Hellenistic kingdoms. One of those kingdoms was led by a man who had been one of Alexander's generals. There was no way Alexander could administer his vast empire by himself, particularly with communications being what they were in the ancient world. And so he appointed trusted generals to be, in effect, his viceroys, his rulers, his subsidiary rulers over different areas of his empire. When he died unexpectedly and at a very early age, each of these generals basically set himself up as king and became the founder of a hereditary dynasty. These are what we call the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Seleucid dynasty took control of Asia Minor and the Near East. The Antigonid dynasty ruled Macedonia. Most importantly for our purposes in this lecture and in the rest of this course, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies. Alexander's general, who was in control of Egypt when Alexander died, was named Ptolemy, and he founded a dynasty that continued to rule over Egypt. In Egypt in the Hellenistic age, Alexandria was the most important city. Alexandria, obviously named after Alexander himself. Now, Greek continued to be the common spoken language, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean world, and Greek cultural norms were reproduced in Hellenistic kingdoms. So these generals of Alexander's carried Greek culture and Greek cultural norms with them. And particularly in Egypt, this was important because Alexandria became, in effect, the cultural capital of the Greek-speaking world. You have to think of the center of Greek civilization,
fucking eyes.
literary production, Greek culture moving from Athens down into Egypt. So the center of Greek culture in the Hellenistic world is no longer Athens. It's Alexandria.
Dirty there, you dumbass. So that must go there.
Greek literature, perhaps comparable to what had happened in Athens.
No, those are there too.
And an astonishing development of scholarship, of the methods and procedures of scholarship in Alexandria during the Hellenistic age. The Hellenistic age came to an end With the fall of the last member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last Ptolemy, Cleopatra, who was defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Interestingly enough, Cleopatra was the first of her family, the first Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, to bother to learn to speak Egyptian. These people were ethnically Greek. They ruled over the Egyptians, but between 323, when Alexander died, all the way down to Cleopatra's lifetime, and again, she was defeated in 31 BC, Cleopatra was the first Ptolemy who bothered to learn to speak the language of the people she was ruling. Now, as with any such age or historical period, these dates are obviously arbitrary to some degree. Nobody woke up in 323 and said, well, that's it, the classical age is over, now we're in the Hellenistic age. And similarly, they didn't say Battle of Actium, okay, that's it, the Hellenistic age is over. But the reason we use those dates as boundaries is because Alexander's death definitely marks the beginning of a new political and cultural era, the fragmentation of his empire into the Hellenistic kingdoms and Greek cultural ascendancy in those kingdoms. And so also, the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC marked a transition from the importance of the Hellenistic kingdoms to the hegemony of Rome, or some scholars in the Hellenistic age in 30 BC with Cleopatra's actual death by suicide. We'll talk more about the Battle of Actium and its importance for Roman culture in a later lecture. But right now, I want to look at Alexandria's cultural and literary importance. As the intellectual center of the Hellenistic Greek age, of Hellenistic Greek culture, Alexandria was noteworthy for its museum and for its library, both of which were founded during the reign of Ptolemy I, and so by the end of the 4th century BC. Alexandria was also famous and important for the scholars and authors who worked at the museum and the library. Museum, or museion in Greek, means place for the muses. It doesn't in this context mean building that holds artifacts, that holds artwork or anthropological artifacts or anything else. It means place for the muses. And the Alexandrian Museum was a center of scholarship, of learning, and of philology, the study of language, the study of literature. Perhaps the closest modern equivalent would be a research foundation associated with a great university. The museum's importance for the history of Western literature, well, for Western culture in general, but for Western literature, is absolutely incalculable. A.W. Bullock puts it this way. He says the museum was, quote, perhaps the most important institution in the history of Europe for the transmission of Western culture. Had the Alexandrian Museum not been founded when it was, Horace, the Roman lyric poet, would probably be the nearest that a modern reader could come to Greek lyric poetry, and we might be reduced to reconstructing Sophocles from Seneca, close quote. Now, remember at the very first introductory lecture when I was grappling with defining Western in the Western literary tradition, I said we can't really say European because some of the authors we'll be talking about lived outside Europe, so they were definitely members of the Western literary and cultural tradition. Here, you have that same idea when Bullock says that the Museum of Alexandria in Egypt was perhaps the most important institution in the history of Europe. So the cultural boundaries do not necessarily line up with the geographical boundaries ever, I suppose. Throughout this course, I've talked about Alexandrian scholars doing this, Alexandrian scholars doing that. These are the scholars that I was talking about. The Great Library of Alexandria was associated with the museum, and during the early years of the museum and the library, a great deal of attention was paid to assembling texts of all known Greek authors. That was the task they set themselves when they founded the library, to set out to try to get copies of every work written by every Greek author. An unprecedented undertaking and an enormously and extremely difficult one. The library, in fact, preserved Greek literature. Now, we have much less of Greek literature than we would like to have, but we would have so very much less of it still had it not been for the library. So the library preserved Greek literature, and equally importantly, the librarians, the heads of the library, and other scholars working there developed techniques of scholarship that we still use to some extent today, and that began the critical and scholarly understanding of the works of Greek literature. So they didn't just gather these works, put them on the shelf, and ignore them. They invented methods of editorial work, of scholarship, of commentary, of comparing different texts to decide which reading was best, and so forth. Among the innovations of Alexandrian scholarship, I could just give you really one example, but among the innovations of Alexandrian scholarship that was crucially important was the division of poems into 24 regularized books each. I've referred over and over again in previous lectures to an ancient work being 24 books long or 9 books long, and I've usually told you that what I mean by that is it took 24 average size papyrus scrolls or 9 papyrus scrolls to write the work out. Well, the Iliad and the Odyssey are both long enough that they take about 24 scrolls to write out. Up until the Alexandrian scholars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, whoever copied the Iliad, whenever a scribe set out to copy the Iliad, he would just write to the end of his first scroll and then start writing on the second scroll. So if he broke off in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a scene, no matter, he just kept writing, and it took usually about 24 scrolls to write the whole Iliad or the whole Odyssey out. The great innovation of the Alexandrian scholars was to realize that if we regularized this, if we said scroll number 1 will always end at this point, scroll number 2 will always begin at this point, suddenly we have a way of referring to specific passages in the text. Do you see what I mean? Instead of saying, do you remember that part about 3 hours into the Iliad where Priam and Helen sit on the wall of Troy and she tells him who the fighters below are? You can say, do you remember in book 3, lines 161 through 170? And so they invented, in effect, the possibility of citation, the possibility of saying book 3, line 161, book 12, line 65. That can only be done if every time book 1 is copied, it stops at the same place. And somebody had to think of that, first off. This was one of the Alexandrians' contributions. The museum and the library not only fostered scholarship, they also fostered creativity. In particular, the Hellenistic age was a time of great poetic output. And one of the most important Hellenistic scholar poets, someone who was both a great scholar and a great poet, was Callimachus, who hit his high point, his Orowit, as we say, around 285 to 270 BC. Callimachus was astonishingly prolific, both in scholarly work and in poetry. His works of scholarship included the catalog of the Library of Alexandria. There's another marvelous innovation in scholarship, not just putting all the books on the shelves, but coming up with a system so they could be found. He cataloged the Library of Alexandria. He did a scholarly edition of Pindar and a bibliography of Greek literature. That's on the scholarly side.
God damn, this is difficult.
On the creative side, he was also a great poet in his own right. More than 800 books total are attributed to Callimachus, but all are lost apart from 6 hymns and around 60 epigrams and a few scattered fragments here and there. We know he was of the utmost importance. We have very little left of his work. We can tell that in many ways his most important work was a book called the Itea, or the Origins. That was a collection in 4 books, that is, 4 papyrus scrolls, of short poems. They perhaps total 4,000 lines in all. In the Itea, Callimachus champions short, elusive, learned poetry rather than long narrative poems. In other words, he sets his own poetic style, his own poetic credo, in direct opposition to epic. He says that Apollo, the god of poetry and song, favors a slender muse. The idea is the muse of poetry has got him bloated, she's overweight, she's fat. Apollo would prefer her to be slender. What we need is short, self-contained, slender poems rather than long, overblown epic ones. And Callimachus's approach to poetry not only favored short poems, but also, as I already said, extremely learned, extremely elusive, extremely scholarly poems. Poetry written, in other words, not to be enjoyed by the masses, but to be understood by the scholars who could recognize the allusions, who could recognize the references to other arcane poetry. And in this regard,
good job, buddy.
Callimachus's approach to poetry was to have absolutely enormous.
This is what you're sneaking on your phone to do.
In particular, on Roman
Watch me do a puzzle.
which is Catullus, to whom we
Feel
will
bad
turn
for you,
next
buddy.
lecture.
Catullus?
Welcome to Lecture 18, in which we will begin our exploration of Roman literature by talking in particular about two extremely important lyric poets, Catullus and Horace. Now, Roman literature in general is inconceivable without Greek models. For every Greek genre that we've looked at so far, epic, drama, history, lyric poetry, there are Roman authors who modeled their own work on their Greek predecessors. We already mentioned this, of course, with comedy, with the works of Menander having been the influences on
This is fucking
the later works of Plautus and Terence.
difficult.
But it was true in every other area of Roman literature as well. And to understand why this is so, we need to consider the historical and cultural relationship between Greece and Rome. So I want to start by talking about that very, very briefly, and then move on to talking about Catullus and Horace. Roman political power was on the rise during and immediately after the time when Greek political power began to wane. If you remember from the previous lecture, Greece came under Philip's domination in 338 BC, under the domination of Philip of Macedon. Rome was just coming into its own as an international power, starting very shortly after that same time period. Rome's position as a major player in the Mediterranean was solidified after a series of 3 wars with Carthage, the North African culture of Carthage. Rome and Carthage engaged in 3 wars with one another called the Punic Wars. Punic from the Latin.
All right, we got that. So that's going to be
Punic War was fought in
black.
264 through
Where's the black
241
ones?
BC.
Get in there.
That's just a few decades after Philip has taken over the control of Greece. Greece is on the wane
Not
at the same
fitting.
time that Rome is on the ascendancy. The Second Punic War, which was the one in which Hannibal was a major player, took place in 218
Say these will fit though.
and the Third Punic War
No,
was fought from
fucker.
151 to 146.
That one will though.
With the end of the Third Punic War in 146, Rome really became the unquestioned dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, including Greece itself. Rome dominated Greece itself. Now, of course, Egypt is still under the control of the Ptolemaic rulers, but Rome is in control of pretty much the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean area. Now, Roman culture, for whatever reason, we can't explore what the reasons might be in this lecture, had very few indigenous art forms or indigenous forms of literature. And instead of developing its own traditions, Rome derived a great deal of its art, its literature, and its mythology from Greece, directly from Greece. Rome borrowed Greek cultural forms and Greek mythological stories. Most important for our purposes, Roman literature followed Greek models very, very directly. Roman poets, when they set out to write epic, wrote in dactylic hexameter, even though that didn't work quite as well in Latin or quite as fluently in Latin as it did in Greek. Roman historians modeled themselves, as we'll see later, on Herodotus and Thucydides. And in this lecture, we'll talk about how Roman lyric poets modeled themselves specifically on Callimachus to a large extent, and on earlier lyric poets as well. Now, in general, Roman attitudes towards Greece and Greek culture were highly ambivalent. Greek culture was admired for its antiquity and its sophistication, but at the same time, it was distrusted and sort of looked down upon all at once. According to legend, Romulus had founded Rome in 753 BC, so the Romans considered themselves a much newer people than the Greeks. The Greeks had been there as far back as mythic memory could reach. They were already major players in the Trojan War in the 12th century. In contrast, the Romans believed that their own culture began in 753 when Romulus founded Rome. So they were a newer people than the Greeks, and to some extent this helped justify their cultural borrowings. Why reinvent the wheel? Why come up with forms of literature from scratch when there are already these fully developed forms, epic, drama, history, lyric, and so forth, waiting to be borrowed from Greece? So on the one hand, Greek culture and the Greeks were looked up to as cultural models by the Romans, but at the same time, the Romans, or at least some Romans, tended to view Greek culture with suspicion. The Greeks were seen as tricky, overly crafty, overly sophisticated, culture, which admired, or at least claimed to admire, plain living, plain speaking, the avoidance of luxury, the avoidance of softness as hallmarks of sterling character. So, from this viewpoint, if you take that idea of what makes a good Roman, that it's someone who speaks the plain truth, who lives a life free of luxury and of over-sophistication, think how Hellenistic culture, the highly refined, learned, erudite Greek culture that we were talking about in the last lecture, as exemplified, for instance, by the poetry of Telemachus, think how that would appear to someone who admires plain speaking and plain living. It would be particularly repellent. It would summarize everything that seemed to be wrong with an over-sophisticated, over-stylized culture. But, of course, conversely, those people within Roman culture who rejected the idea of plain, simple speaking and living might be particularly drawn to Hellenistic culture, to Hellenistic models as a kind of contrast to what they were seeing in their own culture and held up as an ideal. And in fact, in the mid-1st century BC in Rome, we find a group of young men who began to write poetry modeled very closely on the works of Callimachus and other Alexandrian poets. This group of young poets in 1st century BC Rome is often called the Neoterics or the Poetae Novae. Those are terms used for these groups. They mean new poets or almost newfangled poets. These are terms used for this group of poets by Cicero, who did not mean to be complimentary in this terminology, but modern scholars have tended to adopt it and to talk about the Neoterics. The Neoterics took over Callimachus's ideas about what makes great poetry with a great deal of enthusiasm. They wrote short, carefully polished, highly learned, highly elusive poems using arcane and sophisticated references to works of previous literature.
The hell was that other one at?
The more obscure, the better. To give you one example, Catullus, whom I'll be focusing on in just a moment, wants to refer to Heracles in one of his poems. He doesn't say Heracles. He says Falsipares Amphitrioniades, which means the false-parented son of Amphitryon. You have to know that Heracles was the son of Zeus and a human mother, and that Alcmene, Heracles' mother, was married to a man named Amphitryon. Thus, Heracles is the false-parented son of Amphitryon, and that's what you're calling in the poem. It's too simple to say Heracles. The idea is to be as elusive, as highly learned, as obscure as possible. The Neoterics adapted Greek poetic meters to the Latin language, drawing not just on Callimachus, but on earlier Greek lyric poets as well, and they saw themselves as the heirs of Callimachus and other Alexandrian poets. Now, our knowledge of most of the Neoterics is based on very scanty fragments, and several of them are no more than names.
How about this?
Several of whom we know only their names.
The fuck in there.
But the perhaps complete works of one poet, Catullus, have survived. His book may be a bit damaged, but we think we have at least almost everything that he wrote. He was probably born in 84 BC and probably died soon after 54. The latest absolutely securely datable event that he mentions in his work occurred in 55 BC. We're told that he was 30 when he died, so we assume his dates are probably around 84 to around 54, though we're not certain of that. He was from Verona, but apparently spent most of his adult life in Rome, and his poems range from extraordinarily beautiful romantic love lyrics through harshly obscene invective, from intensely personal to directly political. His work was profoundly influential on the next generations of Latin poets, including Horace, Propertius, Tibullus, even Virgil and Ovid, as well as on later European poetry. Catullus's admiration for and adherence to Callimachian models is obvious throughout his work, from the introductory poem of his collection on. The very first
well, there's so many of these round ones that are not
demonstrates several typical
findable
features of the Neoteric style. It's short. The poem is only 10 lines long. It's highly polished, very carefully crafted, very witty. And the first 2 lines of this poem, Catullus uses vocabulary that carefully lays out his poetic program and signals his homage to Callimachus. The first 2 lines are Cui dono lepidum novum bellum, arida modopumic expolitum. To whom do I give this charming new little book, just now polished up with dry pumice stone? Now, the book is charming. Lepidum, think of Callimachus is saying that a poem should be slender, should be charming, should not be overdone, overbloated. The book is little, it's polished. And the Latin metaphor is more immediate than our metaphor when we call a work polished. In Latin, to smooth papyrus before writing on it, you quite literally polish it with pumice stone. So the metaphor is more direct, but the idea is the same. A polished work is a carefully crafted, carefully taken care of, deliberately looked after work. So Catullus's book, he tells us, is charming and is polished. As it's come down to us, it contains three main sections: short poems in a variety of meters, then a simple section of longer poems running to 150 or so lines apiece, and then a third section, a concluding section of short poems in a meter called elegiac couplets. Within these three sections, Catullus covers a wide range of subjects and a variety of tones. And there are several groups of poems that scholars call cycles of poems, that are scattered throughout the work, but that address, each one of these cycles will address the same subject or feature the same people in different parts of the collection. The most famous of these cycles, and the most important for our purposes in this lecture, is the group of poems that Catullus writes to and about a woman whom he calls Lesbia. They're scattered throughout the collection. They show up in all three parts of the work. The Lesbia poems are remarkable and noteworthy in many ways. First of all, they reflect a range of emotions and tones, from absolutely lyrical romanticism, how many kisses of yours would be enough for me, as many as the stars in the sky, that kind of thing, all the way through to bitter despair. In all of them, Catullus manages, through the use of intricate meter and very careful crafting, to adopt a tone that sounds immediate and personal. The same sort of thing we talked about with Sappho, Catullus does to an even greater degree. He sounds as though he's pouring out immediate, personal, heartfelt emotion, but he does it in extremely intricate meter, with careful word placing, careful use of alliteration and assonance, and yet his presentation of heartfelt emotion is so persuasive that many critics, particularly in the 19th century, took these poems utterly at face value, thought that Lesbia was cruel to Catullus. He dashed back home and dashed off one of these poems without even stopping to think about it, that it was a direct outpouring of emotion. Now, most modern critics don't think that, but that is how the poems read. The name Lesbia is clearly meant to recall Sappho. Remember, Sappho was the poet from Lesbos. By using the name Lesbia, which means woman from Lesbos in Latin, Catullus is clearly intending to compliment the woman he addresses with that name upon her erudition and her sophistication. You are as learned and as creative and as skillful and as totally amazing as Sappho, is what's wrapped up in that name. Poem 51, where Catullus addresses a woman by this name, is written in Sapphic meter, the same meter of the poem by Sappho that I read to you several lectures ago, and it's also a free translation of one of Sappho's poems, a poem describing the sensation of watching your beloved across the room talking to somebody else. Sappho and Catullus in his free translation say things like, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth, I'm covered with sweat, my ears are ringing, my eyes are darkening when I see somebody else talking to you and enjoying your conversation, and I'm standing across the room watching. Now, many scholars would assume that poem 51, that is the 51st poem, was the first poem that Catullus wrote to Lesbia. It would be a great way to introduce himself, or to give this woman an idea that he was in love with her. It's a translation of a poem by Sappho. He sends it to her because he knows she's learned enough to appreciate it. If she wants to take it as a personal address to her, she can. If she doesn't want to, well, it's just a translation of a poem by Sappho. So we don't know what chronology, in what order Catullus wrote these poems, but many scholars assume poem 51 is the first in the Lesbia cycle. As the poems appear in the text itself,
Won't anything go anywhere?
Despair in clearly unchronological style. As the cycle continues,
This is
it becomes clear
this
that
is
Lesbia
painful.
is a married woman and that Catullus is only one of many lovers whom she has. And his poems to her run the whole gamut of the emotions one might feel in that situation. From poems in which Catullus assures himself that he really doesn't mind Lesbia's infidelity because he loves him best, to ones where he presents their love as an emotional bond analogous to the strongest ties of the Roman family, to the love that a father might feel for a son, and says that Lesbia has betrayed that bond, to ones in which he denounces her as utterly promiscuous and completely unworthy of his love. So you get the whole picture of this kind of love affair. And the picture Catullus paints of a young man's progress from romantic love to bitter hatred is so very compelling that it's almost irresistible to ask, so who was she anyway? Since AD 158, the answer to that question has been Clodia. Apuleius tells us, as an author we'll meet in a later lecture, tells us that when Catullus wrote Lesbia, he meant Clodia. And the two names are metrically equivalent. She, reading the poems herself, could take the name Lesbia out, put the name Clodia in, and the meter would still work. Now, unfortunately, we know of 3 women who lived at the same time as Catullus named Clodia. 3 sisters, each of them had the family name Clodia. And the evidence is not sufficient to tell us which one of the 3 Catullus meant. The usual identification is with Clodia Metelli, Clodia who was married to a man named Metellus. But this may be due to the chance fact that we know more about her than we know about her sisters, for the reason that one of Cicero's poems has survived, in which Cicero denounces Clodia Metelli as a promiscuous woman who specializes in taking younger lovers, a married woman who is unfaithful to her husband over and over again with younger men. Now, if we knew as much about Clodia Metelli's 2 sisters as we know about her, we might think that one of them fits Catullus's Clodia, Catullus's Lesbia better. There are some chronological problems, particularly with the date when Clodia Metelli was widowed, that make that identification not entirely secure. But in any case, most scholars accept that Lesbia is in fact a pseudonym for a genuine woman, that she's not merely and entirely a fiction that Catullus invented for the sake of his poem.
Can't do it.
In the Lesbia poems, whoever she was and whatever his motivation for writing them, Catullus laid the groundwork for a whole genre of Latin poetry, which scholars call love elegy, in which the poet
Just kicking my ass here.
presents himself as suffering greatly at the hands of a cruel mistress. Domina is the word in Latin, who makes him suffer terrible emotional torments. Now,
Gotta
when
stop.
I say mistress, the word domina in Latin means quite literally mistress in the sense of female owner of a slave. And in a slave-holding society, as Roman culture was, this would be a very powerful metaphor. The poet is saying, I am in the control of this woman I'm in love with, the same way a slave is in the control of his domina, of his owner, his mistress. In the next generation of poets, in the hands of Propertius, Tibullus, and Ovid, love elegy became one of the foremost genres of Latin poetry, and its influence on later European poetry is profound. So Catullus's Lesbia is the ultimate ancestress of Dante's Beatrice, Petrarch's Laura, and Shakespeare's Dark Lady of the Sonnets. The Lesbia poems were only one aspect of Catullus's work. He also wrote short poems on political subjects, on friendship, his love for his home, many other topics. His handling of Greek lyric meters and his use of short, self-contained poems undoubtedly had a great deal of influence on the greatest Latin lyric poet of all, Horace. And I'll turn to Horace, the background material on him, and then looking at his poetic achievement at this point. Quintus Horatius Flaccus, or Horace, as we call him in English, was born on December 8th, 65 BC, and died on November 27th, 8 BC. As those precise dates indicate, we know much more about his life than we know about Catullus's life, partly because he included many biographical details in his own poetry, but also because an ancient biography of Horace by Suetonius has survived, so we know much more about him. Horace was born in Venusia. His father was a freedman, that is, a man who had been born born a slave but set free during his life, and yet Horace's freedman father managed to provide for his son an education that would normally have been given to an upper-class Roman youth. Horace
Maybe I'll make some fucking progress now.
Athens. This makes it quite clear that his parents recognized his abilities and had ambitions for their extraordinarily talented son. However, these ambitions almost came to nothing because Horace's family was on the wrong side in the civil wars after the assassination of Julius Caesar. They lost all their possessions, and Horace was lucky not to have lost his life. The crisis brought on by Caesar's assassination in 44 BC was the culmination of decades of social upheaval. After Caesar's death, there was an open power struggle for many years. At first, Caesar's trusted friend Mark Antony and Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son Octavian, later to be known as Augustus, banded together to fight against Brutus and Cassius, the ringleaders of the assassins of Caesar. Horace and his family made the mistake of siding with Brutus. In fact, Horace fought in Brutus's army. After Mark Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian began to struggle with one another for leadership. It became fairly clear that the upshot was going to be one-man rule. The question was just which one man it would be. Mark Antony became involved with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Yes, the last of the Ptolemies, the same Cleopatra I was talking about in the previous lecture. And many Romans feared that the two of them, Antony and Cleopatra, were planning to form a joint empire, joining Rome and Egypt together under their rulership as king and queen, or emperor and empress. Finally, in 31 BC, Octavian defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium.
Where the hell did those eyes go?
Ending the Hellenistic Age, as we talked about in the previous lecture.
I don't see them anymore.
Victory at Actium, Octavian became the all but acknowledged sole ruler of Rome, and he remained so until his death in AD 14.
Are those
in
it?
27 BC, he was awarded the title Augustus, which means the revered one, but which came to function as his name. Now, modern historians refer to Augustus as the first
Those must be it.
emperor, but Augustus himself was scrupulous about never using any terms of kingship. He did not say, "I am king of Rome." What he said was, "I have restored Roman government to its old-fashioned republican form." He was very, very careful not to say that he was a one-man ruler, but rather to say that he had brought back the good old days of republican government. He was also a patron of the arts, of cultural matters, and the arts, including poetry. Now, Augustus's patronage of poets wasn't direct. In other words, he did not go out and hire a poet himself and give the man money to write poetry. Rather, Augustus worked through his friend Maecenas, an extremely rich man who provided financial support for various poets and served as the link between those poets and Augustus. Horace, despite his support of Brutus, despite the fact that he had fought against Octavian, later Augustus, Horace was lucky enough to become one of Maecenas' proteges. This was probably in large part because of the influence of Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, who we'll talk about in the next lecture, who introduced Horace to Maecenas. However it came about, Maecenas' patronage gave Horace the resources and the security he needed to enjoy 3 decades of working life as a poet. Among other things, Maecenas gave Horace a farm, gave him a place to live, a means of living, sustenance, enough to live on, and so Horace could dedicate himself to writing poetry, which he did.
The hell's this?
His output includes a book of epodes, 2 books of satires, and 2 books of epistles. But Horace's most famous poems, and the ones that have had the most influence on later poetry, are his 4 books of odes. The odes are a collection of lyric poems in a variety of meters, all of the meters adapted from Greek lyric poetry. They include love lyrics to various different addressees, political statements, vignettes of daily life. Unlike Catullus, in all of the odes, Horace adopts a tone that is detached and often wryly amused. He doesn't present himself as in the throes of deep passion or deep emotion. He never expresses the depths of either joy or despair that we see in Catullus's amatory poetry, but within his controlled and mannered persona, Horace achieves great lyrical beauty and extraordinarily
God of my
memorable
life.
poetry. And in terms of their form, the odes are a tour de force. Horace adapts Greek meters to Latin poetry with an astonishing versatility and success. Now, Catullus had done this already, as I mentioned. Poem 51, in which Catullus translates Sappho, is written in Sapphic meter. But Horace perfects the process, and the odes show an astonishing facility with meter, word choice, and word placement, which unfortunately makes them fundamentally untranslatable, particularly into a language such as English, which is a non-inflected language. By that I mean very briefly that in English, meaning is expressed by word order. The dog bit the cat and the cat bit the dog mean two entirely different things because of word order. Latin is an inflected language where the words change form depending on whether they're subject or object in the sentence and for their other uses in the sentence. And that means that Latin word order is enormously flexible, and Horace uses this to great effect in his poems. The opening lines of one of his most famous poems, Odes 1, Book 1, Poem 5, often called the Pyrrha Ode, give some idea of his technique. A literal translation of the first three lines of this poem would read, Pyrrha, what graceful boy drenches fragrances, urges you among many roses in a pleasant cave. But the Latin word order is, what many graceful you, boy among roses, drenched liquid urges, fragrances pleasant, Pyrrha in cave. The word order of the first line, quis multa gracilis te puerin rosa, mimics what it's describing. The word te, which means you, referring to Pyrrha, is at the center of the line, surrounded
Can't
by
fucking
the
do
words,
it.
just as Pyrrha himself is being embraced by the boy. You cannot get that effect in English. That's what I mean by saying it's fundamentally untranslatable. However, no less a poet than John Milton tried. And Milton, in his translation, tries to preserve both the Latin meter and the word order as much as possible. Milton writes for this poem, what slender youth bedews liquid odors, courts thee on roses in some pleasant cave. Pyrrha, for whom bind'st thou and wreaths thy golden hair, plain in thy neatness. Oh, how oft shall on faith and changed gods complain, and seas rough with black wind storms, unwanted shall admire, who now enjoys thee credulous, cold, who always vacant, always amiable, hopes thee, of flowing gales unmindful. Hapless they, to whom thou untried seem'st fair. Me and my vowed picture the sacred wall declares to have hung by dank and dropping weeds to the stern god of sea. Now, Milton's attempt to preserve the Latin word order means that his English is very hard to follow unless you have the Latin in front of you. David Ferry, a modern poet, has done a very, very different version of the parallel version, I think helps you see the problems with translating Horace. Ferry's version of Ode 1.5 is, perfumed debonair youth is it among the blossoming roses, urging himself on you in the summer grotto. For whom have you arranged your shining hair so elegantly and simply?
There you go, you dumb son of a bitch.
Because of betrayal, and weep because of the fickleness of the gods, wondering at the way the darkening wind suddenly disturbs the calm waters. Now he delights in thinking how lovely you are, vacant of storm as the fragrant air in the garden, not knowing at all how quickly the wind can change. Hapless are they enamored of that beauty which is untested yet, and as for me, the votive tablet on the temple wall is witness that in tribute to the god I have hung up my sea-soaked garment there. Milton's and Ferry's translation give you some indication of just how difficult it is to translate Horace. They're working with the same poem. They come up with very, very different approaches, different word choice, different word placement. But despite the difficulty of translating Horace, no other lyric poet of antiquity has had so strong an influence on English poetry during the Renaissance and the neoclassical age. Impossible though a true translation of Horace may be, not only Milton and Ferry, but Wyatt, Dryden, Pope, and countless other English poets were irresistibly drawn to try. So this lecture has begun our look at Roman literature through talking about Catullus and Horace. Horace. In the next lecture, we will turn to Roman epic.
I'm gonna have to give up.
About Virgil and
No.
the great foundational epic for Rome, the Aeneid.
All right, stopping. The fuck? We done. 2 hours.